I'm Chris Faricy, the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the Hicker Family Professor in Renewing Democratic Community here at Syracuse University. This panel discussion of the 2024 election is part of both the State of Democracy lectures, along with an event in the Maxwell School's Centennial Election Series. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands.
And my name is Margaret Talev. I'm a journalist and the founding director of Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship in Washington, D.C. I'm also a professor of practice in the Newhouse School. And I come to today's conversation with the perspective of a reporter, a journalist who spent many years covering voters, presidential campaigns, elections, and the White House, and really studying how Americans' media diets shape their political identities and their perceptions of reality.
Thank you, Margaret. In under 2 weeks, Election Day 2024 will arrive, bringing a close to a presidential race marked by turbulence and at times unprecedented events. This year's campaign has been defined by dramatic twists. President Biden's withdrawal from the race, Vice President Harris's ascendance as the Democratic nominee, and 2 assassination attempts targeting former President Donald Trump. Despite and possibly because of these upheavals, the outcome remains highly uncertain, with control of the White House and Congress still up in the air. But beyond the question of who will govern, elections represent a collective act of civic participation, a shared ritual in our democratic tradition. National elections, largely due to the tireless efforts of the media, send a strong signal to a busy and often inattentive public, reminding them that this is a moment to pause and reflect on policymakers' past performance and learn about the party's policy agendas. Importantly, national campaigns are not solely the realm of political elites or strategists. They thrive on the dedication of ordinary citizens who knock on doors, make phone calls, write postcards, and volunteer at polling places. Election campaigns, at their best, emphasize that by expressing our views and engaging with others, we have the power to shape a better future. Yet we find ourselves this year at a crossroads. Despite the demonstrated power of democratic engagement, we face troubling headwinds, declining trust in federal institutions, including the presidency and the electoral process, a growing skepticism of traditional media, and a shared concern across the political spectrum about democracy's future. Today, our distinguished panel will explore what this election season reveals about the state of American democracy and the path forward. Let me introduce our experts. First, Jennifer Stromer-Galley is a professor in the School of Information Studies. She is the former president of the Association of Internet Researchers. She is the 2019 recipient of the Katzer Professor of the Year Award, and her book, Presidential Campaigning in the Internet Age, received the 2015 Top Book Award in Political Communications. She received her PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Shana Gadarian is the Merrill Goldberg Fabian Professor of Excellence in Citizenship and Critical Thinking and the Associate Dean for Research at the Maxwell School. She is co-author of Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World, and Pandemic Politics, The Deadly Toll of Partisanship in the Age of COVID-19. Gadarian's research interests are in American politics, political psychology, and political communication, and her research has been funded by the NSF, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation. Her PhD in politics is from Princeton University. Peter Enns is a professor in the Department of Government in the Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. He is also the co-founder and chief data scientist at the polling firm Verasight. He was executive director of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research from 2015 to 2022. And Peter Enns has published 3 books: Hijacking the Agenda, Economic Power and Political Influence, Incarceration Nation, and Who Gets Represented. His PhD is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
I'd like to introduce our journalist now. Laura Barrón-López is White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and part of the PBS team that was honored this year with the Peabody. And Alex Thompson, my colleague, is the national political correspondent for Axios. Both have reported on the Biden-Harris administration and have been covering this year's campaign. Both are political analysts with CNN, and both are also political alum, and my friends and colleagues.
Great, thank you so much. Today's session will be divided into 2 parts. Though in the first 50 minutes, Margaret and I will moderate a discussion with our panel. In the second half, we're going to open it up to you, the audience, to ask questions. If you have questions during the course of our discussion, please feel free to submit those through the Q&A box at any time, and then we'll get to those around 1 o'clock. So let's go ahead and begin. So Laura and Alex, I would like to pose a question to both of you, actually, and about how you go about covering campaigns. So you have extensive experience covering presidential campaigns. And I'm wondering that when you're developing a story, who do you envision as your audience? And particularly, once you envision who your audience is, how do you balance your audience's interest in what I would deem non-essential, but nevertheless entertaining aspects of the campaigns versus what you believe is the most important information for them to know as voters?
I can go first. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Okay,
Go
great.
on.
Sorry. You can tell that we're very close to election day because I'm having one of those days as a reporter where you're working on 3 stories at once. And I left my computer at home and I realized right as I got into the office. So I apologize if my little viewfinder looks a little different than everyone else's. The way I approach stories, I mean, it's kind of changed over the course of my career. Sometimes it depends on the place that you work on, to be honest with you. When I worked at Politico, we were focused a lot more on inside baseball. What are campaigns thinking about on the inside? What are Democrats and Republicans fighting about with each other? Internally, how are they making these decisions for their campaign? And sometimes a lot of the focus would be that in the stories. And that isn't necessarily always what voters want to read or necessarily what helps inform their decision for who they ultimately vote for. It's still necessary reporting. I think it's still important reporting. But so I've shifted a bit from focusing more on that when I worked at a place like Politico to now at PBS NewsHour. A lot of what we ask ourselves when we're putting a piece together is how much is this informing the public and them being able to make a decision about who they vote for? It's much more policy focused in how those policies impact everyday Americans' lives. It's much more focused on voter voices, like what exactly are voters saying versus what the campaign is saying about how they're messaging to voters. So we try to center voter voices across battleground states as much as possible and local voices as much as possible. And so I've traveled to almost every single battleground state this cycle, I think. I think I've gone to every single one. Most recently was in North Carolina, and we have 2 pieces that are coming out. One today, another one early next week. One is focused on young voters, Gen Z voters, who were seeing a really big gender gap present itself with Gen Z voters. And so when we went about constructing that story, it was, okay, how much do Gen Z voters matter in North Carolina? North Carolina had, out of potentially all the battlegrounds, has the 3rd biggest population of Gen Z voters. Kamala Harris's campaign is clearly trying to drive up young female voters in terms of turnout. Trump's campaign is trying to drive out young male voters. And so we wanted to be sure that we were finding some of those voters on the ground to talk about why they're leaning which way they are, what issues are important to them, and where how the candidates are talking to them. The other story was on election security, which is one of the things that at NewsHour we've tried to focus on the most, in terms of what's the disinformation and the conspiracy theories that are swirling around American elections, and how we can pre-bug some of those, because we consider that incredibly important to people being able to cast their vote in an informed way.
And hi, you can also tell it's less than 2 weeks before election day because I've run out of clean clothes. I'm in a hotel room and I'm in a hoodie. But and Laura, I think is like completely right that some of this is based on where you're working, because especially in this, there is no media outlet now that is, Walter Cronkite or sort of has. It's a balkanized media environment with each having different audiences and also each different having different roles. And Laura and I both covered 2020 together, and she's like done the range of both doing what she's doing now, which is more policy focused, more like local voices, really amplifying how people are feeling on the ground. Whereas I've spent the last several years much more focused, at Axios, our readership is like, news junkies, right? Like professionals that are reading the news most days that are really interested in the inside baseball. I would sort of distinguish between, the horse race. There's, in my opinion, there's a difference between horse race coverage and insider baseball. Now, you could all argue that all insider baseball coverage is horse race coverage. But the way I think about it is it's not so much who's up and who's down, but can you take people inside the deliberations within the campaign and say, this is how people are thinking about it right now. This is how they're not thinking about it. I think too often the horse race coverage is like, Kamala Harris like looks like she's going to lose, or Donald Trump looks like he's going to win. And the truth is, like, a lot of the times we don't really know. But if you can bring people, I've always sort of thought that, like, at the end of the day, like, the stakes are very big, with who wins the White House, with who's governing. But at the end of the day, everyone's always like, these are just people at the end of the day. And the White House, even despite its prestige, is just a workplace like any other. There are workplace rivalries. There are, hyper ambitious people trying to do their best, but also frustrated by other people. There are factions. And those really affect real decisions that go on. And that goes for the campaigns as well. So in terms of the Axios audience, and how I think about those things, that's sort of where I'm focused on.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open up to our other panelists if they want to ask any follow-ups based upon Laura and Alex's answer.
So I'll jump in, Jenny here. So I'm currently in Glasgow and in Scotland. There might be a Glasgow somewhere in the US, but I'm not there. Anyway, watching BBC, right, which is public broadcasting. I think Americans, we tend to think of BBC as high quality news. And my small N of just 7 days, one of the things I'm observing is that Donald Trump is getting substantially more coverage than Kamala Harris is. For example, when Donald Trump went to, I don't know what state, but when he did the McDonald's event, that got significant coverage on the BBC. There's like a 4-minute clip, and then talk about his policies and all these other things, interviewing supporters, and then it shifted to Harris, and about a minute was devoted to her, and it showed her kind of walking, not doing anything sort of meaningful. She looks a lot angry at some point. But across my week, I'm seeing more time spent on Trump than Clinton. Sorry, that's funny. That's where I was going. So than Harris. But we know from 2016 that Donald Trump received substantially more news coverage from journalists than Clinton did. And there's some speculation that that made a difference in the election outcomes. So to my working journalist colleagues, how do you guys navigate this challenge of thinking about airtime and balance as it relates to these issues?
Sure, I can take a step first. I can't speak for BBC, but I at PBS NewsHour, we've done a variety of things. I think there's also a big difference in, yes, Trump still gets a lot of coverage. It's different coverage than it was in 2016. In 2016, his speeches would be carried live for their entirety. That doesn't happen anymore. But also, I think maybe why you're seeing a lot of coverage dedicated to him is because of the nature of his campaign. I mean, he is running an anti-democratic, small d democratic campaign. He has said that he wants to persecute and go after his enemies, be them the press or be them Democrats, that he may very well use the National Guard and the military against American citizens. And so the press can't just ignore that. We can't ignore when Mark Kelly, his former chief of staff, increasingly comes out in the days leading up to the election saying that Trump said he wishes he had Hitler's generals. So that's going to take a lot of time to dissect and to cover. And I think by nature of that, that means we end up sometimes covering him more than Harris and her childcare policy. But that being said, what NewsHour has tried to do is, over the course of the months leading up to the election, we also try to have breakout set 7-minute reports that show what is Harris's specific policy on abortion and what is Trump's specific policy on abortion. They're called our policy and promises debriefs that myself, as well as other correspondents, are dedicated to filling out a full report of where exactly the two candidates stand on abortion policy, on healthcare policy more generally, on climate change, on crime. I did one on the economy. So across the board, we have done that in the months leading up. We've also done a number of reports on Project 2025. So trying to make it very specific to what exactly are they proposing for their administrations and what impact would that have on you? Now, do we always do a perfect job? No, I don't think so. Does everyone across the media do a perfect job and totally know exactly how to cover this moment? Not necessarily. And some of it is learning on the fly, but I do think that generally we're doing a better job than we were in 2016.
I agree with what Laura said. First of all, the one thing I will say about this debate that has, and I think it's a very good debate to have, but sometimes I think there's like this implicit belief on some of the people having the debate that if the media did X, then Trump wouldn't win. That if media covered Trump the perfect way, then it would prevent him from going. And I think that at times that precludes the idea that he's winning because people like what he says, which is a different issue to reckon with than the media coverage. In terms of how this has ebbed and flowed, and the reason I also say that is because this in terms of how media has covered him, it has really ebbed and flowed. Laura pointed out in 2016 they would cover the rallies live. There was almost sort of like a giddiness to it. I also think when you had sort of a declining platform, like declining legacy media and cable TV where ratings were low, this was like a ratings bonanza, and so they followed the audience. I do think you definitely don't see that aspect anymore, but arguably we're covering him just as much in a much more critical, discerning way. But in terms of the full volume of coverage, we're covering him just as much as we did in 2016. Now, you can also contrast that with that period post-presidency, post January 6th to basically when he began running again in those 2 years, he actually wasn't covered that often. And yet he still remained popular, with the Republican base. And so it's, I don't necessarily know there's always a correlation between volume of coverage and not. And then, one of these other frustrating things, as like frustrating and as like as a question as a journalist. So let's take the baseless rumors of eating the dogs and the cats. That demanded scrutiny and coverage. At the same time, from Trump's perspective, I can tell you, and we'll see how it works at an election day. Maybe a lot of Americans will find those comments disqualifying. But from Trump's perspective, the next week, the entire conversation was dominated by immigration. And I'm sure a lot more people were aware of the fact that there were a lot more migrants in this small Ohio town than they were before he made those comments. So in some ways, he's incentivized to make these outrageous race baiting comments, and because of the amount of oxygen. And you're seeing, from Harris's perspective, she's having trouble getting media oxygen right now. I mean, she basically had the debate in the DNC and the VP, and picking the VP, but has struggled to, get a huge moment. Probably the next biggest moment, it was like the Bret Baier interview, but that was still less than 10 million viewers. So that's not a clear answer, because I don't think there is a clear answer, but that's sort of my word vomit reaction to the question.
Okay. Great. Thanks. I'm going to turn now to talking about emotions during the presidential campaign, and exclusively how campaigns try to elicit certain emotions from voters. So, Shana, you wrote the book on this, and one thing I couldn't help but notice over the past couple of weeks is that when Harris was at the DNC, it was a campaign of joy, right? If I remember right, there was Oprah, like I think screaming joy to the audience with some type of jazz hands, right? And in the past couple of weeks, there's been a pivot to more talking about fear, right? And when Harris kicked off the campaign of joy in part was meant as a clear contrast to Trump's campaign of fear of immigrants, fear of rising inflation. But now in the closing weeks, we have two campaigns who are both evoking fear among their base, but in different ways. So can you tell us a little bit about how the emotion of fear affects voters and how they prioritize issues, whether they vote or not, who they vote for?
Sure, like it's an emotions question, so it's like a bat signal for me, which is very exciting. So I have spent a lot of my career studying the role of threat and emotion in politics. So I'll just start with like a little anecdote. When I went on the job market in 2008, I was talking about kind of fear about terrorism and how that influenced American attitudes about politics. And I had someone at a job talk say, like, why are we talking about fear? Isn't this like the era of hope and change? And I was like, well, I think it's probably true that fear is like evergreen and that it should matter in politics. And, I don't want to say I was right, but I was right. And like, but I think what you're pointing out is something that we see across multiple election cycles. Even in 2008, right, we have this kind of hope and change election with Barack Obama. A lot of his ads are negative, right? His ads in the primary are negative. His ads throughout the campaign in 2008 are about what happens if you don't choose me as the candidate. And that is a kind of theme that we see across presidential election cycles, which is that candidates, particularly candidates who are not well known, start off talking about themselves and their biography. They start in a very positive way, because it's important to kind of have an emotion, a positive emotion when you're starting to introduce yourself, your biography, who you are, what you stand for in the beginning of a campaign. So Yana Krupnikoff at University of Michigan has shown this over the course of campaigns as well. but as you're starting to then get toward contrasting yourself, and often at the beginning of an election, we don't know who the opponent will be. But when you get to the part of a general campaign where you're comparing yourself and your platform and your party against an opponent, that's when we get contrasting in terms of our rhetoric, in terms of ads. And there's where threat and kind of fear might be more helpful. So fear is a kind of basic emotion that everyone feels in different, different amounts and about different issues. But part of what candidates want to do is identify the areas that are meaningful and where their party benefits and try and draw your attention to it. And one of the ways they often do that is through making you feel uncertain and threatened and fearful about what will happen on that issue if the other team wins. And this is useful because it, one, draws to the stakes of the election, and two, gets you to focus on areas that they are strong on. So I'm not that surprised that we have seen a turn from this joy to more threat and fear, because what Harris needs to do now is say the stakes of the election are democracy and abortion rights and education and the economy. And these are areas where my candidacy and my party is strong. And you should pay attention. So fear makes us pay attention, and it makes us use information that you're hearing more than your partisan identity and more than your kind of standing decisions in choosing. We don't have a ton of evidence that fear gets you to turn out more, but it does bring home the stakes of the election, and it gets you to pay attention, which is a lot of what the candidates want you to do in the run up to an election.
Okay, thanks. So you had talked about how this might impact the base of Democrat and Republican voters. What about for folks who are relatively disengaged from politics, who might be, some of these critical blocks in these swing states, who are independent because they just don't pay attention to politics? How might they respond to fear differently than partisans?
Sure. I mean, so I think part of what we can see is that it might take a larger amount and a different kind of fear to get them to pay attention, because again, fear is very uncomfortable for people. So they want to mitigate against that. So one way you can do that is just avoid politics altogether, which I think is what we see often with independents, is they just can't deal. They don't want to engage in politics, so they avoid it. But another way that you can make yourself feel better when you feel fearful about politics is to gather information. And so I think to the extent that what candidates want to do with independents is you want to get them to feel uncertain and to pay attention to issues so that they gather more information. So it's not necessarily about the amount of fear. It's more about finding areas where they might care, and it may get them to pay attention and then gather some information.
Great, thanks. So I'll now open it up to the panel to ask any follow-ups they want of Shana.
Actually, Shana, I got a question. I sort of want to ask you, do you see the flip side? If Harris promised joy but has given us fear as her closing argument, do you see, among all the apocalyptic, the world is ending, Trump campaign stuff, do you see a little bit of joy? Because when I see him put on the McDonald's apron, I feel like that's his version of joy. Trump the entertainer, Trump the fun guy. It's Trump with Elon. It's Trump with Joe Rogan. That's a turn off to some people, but I feel like for a lot of voters, that is the joy or the uplift factor. Maybe you read it differently. I don't know.
It's not that I don't think that there's joy. I think often there's a kind of, how do I put this? There's a little bit of a joy at the expense of other people in kind of Trump's messaging, which is the country, I care about you, disaffected voter, and I want to bring you something, and I'm going to do that by deporting a lot of people, right? I think there is in his kind of rhetoric at the rallies, I do think there's a sense that he's having fun, I think it's a little bit different than like the more kind of like joy comes in the morning, almost religious kind of joy that you see. And like, yeah, actually, one thing I didn't mention is I do think part of the joy at the kind of Harris or an Obama kind of joy is a kind of like multi-messages to Black voters, that there is a kind of religious aspect of that they get to both message to Black voters who have an experience in a Black church, and also this kind of a more generalized message. I'm not sure I see. It's not that that Trump and the kind of that joy is not there. I just think there's a like kind of a different tone to it. It's a very different kind of messaging. It's a like a much more in the base kind of messaging, whereas I think the promise of the Harris message is like things will get better, and that we can like that there's this kind of multivocal kind of messaging in the joy part, that I just don't see in the Trump piece of it.
Shana, can I build off Margaret's question to ask about emotions and gender, right? So, you know, a lot of the Trump statements that have gotten attention, you know, the Arnold Palmer comments was kind of about, you know, an older version of manhood, going on Joe Rogan. Obviously, a lot of the Harris outreach have been to women. What do we know about different emotional appeals based upon gender?
Yeah, I think there's some more limitations on what women are allowed to do. And also, Ishmael White and Antoine Banks have a new book out about the limitations that Black candidates have, and particularly Black men have, in using anger. So I think identity allows some people to have some emotions more effectively on the campaign trail than others. So I think anger on women is hard. You know, how you calibrate it, and how it's not seen as disqualifying for different reasons, but in similar ways that Banks and White talk about for Black candidates. They have kind of a different kind of repertoire that they're kind of allowed to use by norms. I think so. I'm actually going to go back to Margaret's question and this piece about Arnold Palmer and his manhood, or whatever you want to talk about, was like Trump seemed to be having fun, right? Like he was kind of like rapping. He was like, you know, having his thoughts about what it means to be a man. And I do think that white candidates and white men in particular have a kind of repertoire of emotions that you see that is a little bit broader, that they are kind of allowed to use. And anger is one that they're allowed to use. Fear is one that they're allowed. And allowed means like it's effective and people aren't confused by it. And like but I think there's, again, some limitations on how women, and Black women in particular, are allowed to express their reactions to the state of the world. That means like Harris and other Black female candidates have to kind of navigate what is expected of them and how they have to rise above that in ways that white male candidates don't have that same kind of set of limitations.
Great, thank you. So I now want to turn to Peter. Peter, I can't help but notice the growing role of predictive modeling in election coverage. And political scientists have developed their own set of models. And a lot of these models, yours included, are based on what we call election fundamentals, kind of structural factors that shape voting behavior. So I wonder if you could walk us through two things. First, what exactly are these fundamental factors, and how do they help us understand how citizens vote? And also, how have you incorporated these into your own model?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
So I would say that when political scientists talk about the fundamentals in regard to presidential elections, there's really The economy is one key factor. And so, and I think behind this, with the US presidential elections, we need to remember it's really a choice between two major parties. And there's been cases when, Ross Perot was the most successful third party candidate with 19%. But really, in recent elections, it's a Democrat or Republican candidate. And so the economy, how the economy is doing is one critical fundamental that political scientists have shown matters a lot for, are you choosing the Democrat or Republican candidate? But we might think of it as, are you choosing the incumbent candidate or that who's running against the incumbent? And so if the economy is doing well, that bodes very well for the incumbent. And then another critical fundamental political scientists look at is approval of the incumbent White House, approval of the current president. And the idea there is that captures a lot of things. That captures partisanship in the electorate, that captures views towards current policy, that captures concerns with current policy. And so again, quite naturally, if approval of the president is high, that bodes well for the incumbent party. There's a few other critical fundamentals political scientists sometimes look at. One is how long the incumbent party's been in the White House. So you might think of it as if the same party's been in the White House for multiple terms, then voters might be ready for a change. But it's really these macro level factors, and they turn out to be highly predictive of the election outcome. And it raises questions of how much, despite hundreds of millions of dollars going into the campaign, how much does that matter? Meaning, how much does that influence the vote? Or is it just voters ending up where we would have expected based on these fundamentals? So to give an example, in 2020, a PhD student of mine and I, his name is Julius Lagadny, so we generated a forecast. And we did something different than a lot of forecasts. Most forecasts in political science are forecasting the national outcome, the national vote, the popular vote. Well, of course, it's the Electoral College that matters. So we looked at economic conditions and presidential approval in each state. Based on that, made a state level prediction. Our data were from 100 days before the election or earlier. And so looking at information available to us on these fundamentals 100 days in advance, we correctly forecasted 49 out of 50 states. And so that suggests, at least in 2020, the fundamentals were highly predictive of where things ended up. And I think what we're seeing now, based on the forecast we've put together for this year, is things seem to be shifting to align with where the fundamentals were 100 days out.
Okay, so can you tell us, what does your model say right now about who the fundamentals say is favored to win?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, it's really important that it's state level presidential approval data and state economic factors from 100 days out. So at that time, if we think back, that was right about when Biden dropped out and Harris became the Democratic nominee. So the first forecast we ran was just looking at Biden, and based on his approval ratings, which were very low, and although the economy is doing well in some respects, most of the economic gains were early in Biden's term, and we've shown that it's more recent economic changes that matter more. And so the economic conditions were pretty middling. So our forecast gave Biden less than a 1 in 10 chance of winning the election. And so when we think back, why did Biden drop out so abruptly? There was kind of some conversation at the time. What did Nancy Pelosi say when she met with Biden? Well, she didn't have our forecast, I don't think. But if she did, it would have been, you have less than 1 in 10 chance. This isn't going to work out. So then we made an adjustment based on Harris having a higher approval rating than Biden, and it pulled to a little over a 1 in 4 chance for Harris. And it makes sense. If the incumbent president was facing fundamentals so disadvantageous that he dropped out of the race, it's an uphill battle for the Democrats. And what we've seen now is forecast models that are updated. So this is all 100 days in advance. The models that are updated each day by each new poll. So The Economist now has a slight edge toward Trump. Nate Silver has an edge toward Trump. 538 has an edge toward Trump. If we look at the betting markets are showing Trump's more favorable. So again, this isn't to say what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty. A lot can change in the next 2 weeks. But the shift in the forecasts that are being updated daily and the shift in the betting markets is aligning with the fundamentals from 100 days out.
Okay, thanks.
Although those predictive markets are not necessarily good predictors. I just want to throw that. They are 50-50. So just like
Jenny, I think that's a great point that they don't tell us what's going to happen, but they tell us where people are betting. Millions, not individual. Well, some individuals might be putting down $1 million, but in the aggregate, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars are being placed. And so just like any bet, we don't know what's going to happen, but it says where a lot of people are making a financial, high level financial stake. And so it isn't so the point isn't that the betting markets are going to tell us what happened. It's that the betting markets are aligning with where the fundamentals were 100 days out.
It's so interesting. I have like a million polling questions that I want to bring Alex and Laura into the conversation with Peter on, but I want to bring Jenny in first. Jenny, you and I have been leading this really interesting social media research project this year that uses graph technology to map how these ads, paid ads on Facebook, Meta platforms are spreading both information and misinformation as they relate to the US presidential candidates. And I was just hoping you could kind of share with everyone on this call, like without predicting winners or losers, what kind of patterns have really stood out to you around the issues, the tactics, the spending that could impact how voters are perceiving and acting at the polls?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So we've been tracking the spending on Facebook and Instagram, basically the ads that are running there, and looking at the messages, basically the strategies by the candidates. This election season, we're also looking at outside organizations, so these kind of extra party networks and shady actors who are running ads on Facebook and Instagram around the presidential campaign. One of the surprises this election season is how much the Democratic ticket is outspending the Republican ticket on Facebook and Instagram. We estimate about a 10-to-1 spend differential between the Biden-Harris ticket and the Trump ticket on Facebook and Instagram. There's been reporting that that differential exists in other platforms except for Twitter. Actually, Trump looks like he's spending more money on Twitter on sponsored tweets than Harris is. But that makes sense. That's where his base is. His supporters are more likely to be on X, I think. But it's different than 2020. So I tracked the data in 2020 as well. And Biden spent about $88 million on Facebook and Instagram ads in 2020. Trump spent about $82 million. So not a huge gap between them, a lot of money. And so it's puzzling to me, the differential. So we've been looking as well at these outside organizations, because I think it's a reasonable question. Well, maybe some of these related party groups and others are filling in the gap in terms of targeting ads on Facebook and Instagram. And we actually don't find that. Actually, there's about 50 million has been spent by outside organizations that mention any of the presidential primary candidates, including the VPs. But in terms of kind of a partisan network, it's relatively even in terms of Republican leaning and Democrat leaning ad spend. We also looked at the amount of civility in the advertisements. One of the things that has been a concern this election season is just how negative the advertising and the messaging more broadly has been. We find that of Trump's ads that he's running on the platforms, about 65% are negative, 68% are negative. Whereas Harris's, it's a much lower percentage, about 25%. So, that's interesting. We also looked at these outside organizations to see what their incivility levels are, if you will, or negative ads. And we find that around the assassination, there was a lot of public calls to bring the temperature down in the election. And we found that immediately after the assassination attempt, the one that happened in Butler, Pennsylvania in June, there was a drop. And then immediately following that, there's an increase in negative ads about Harris. And then it drops off, and then there's an increase in negative ads about Trump. So, that data goes to the end of August. So I don't know what September looks like, although I would predict actually that it continues to increase in terms of the negative advertising. We know that the closer elections are to, that is, the more tightly contested the election is, the more likely they are to be negative. And so that's definitely bearing out this election season. The last thing I'll note is that we've also uncovered a fairly large network of Facebook pages running ads that are targeted to Trump supporters. It's not tied to the Trump campaign at all, but it's targeted to Trump supporters. That's actually a credit card scam. So the messages say things like, if you're a true Trump supporter, now's the time. Click the link, take a poll, give your credit card information to pay for the shipping and handling, and we'll send you a free Trump hat or flag. But in the teeny tiny fine print that's underneath the scroll that you wouldn't typically look at, it says that you're going to give $80 a month to the Make America Great Again Club or the Patriots of America Club or whatever. And it's targeted primarily to older men. And in battleground states, which is concerning.
Thank you. Alex and Laura, if I can, I'd like to bring you guys back into the conversation with Peter, because you may have questions for the pollster. I have one. It's just an easy softball question. Is this all completely baked in the cake on inflation then? And if that's the case, does a candidate's election really matter? There's a lot of hand wringing from Democrats in the last week or so saying Harris is spending too much time going negative on Trump. She's not making the case for herself. I watched that town hall as a nonpartisan journalist. I watched that CNN town hall the other night and was really scratching my head as to why she just kept going after Trump and literally wouldn't emotionally engage with any of the panelists, wouldn't ask them, all these students who were basically Vice President Harris, I really want to vote for you, but I'm undecided. Tell me why I should. And she just couldn't bring herself to be what do you care about? What is she just wouldn't connect. Does it matter? Or is that all crap and it's really just about inflation and none of the rest of it matters?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that's a softball question, but I'll share a few thoughts, and I'm curious what others have to say also. I think at the big picture, it is sort of what's baked in. Sort of views of the current president, views of the economy are baked in. But that's not, especially in such a close election, a few things or a lot of tiny things can still shift the outcome if it's really close. And so it kind of, the political science perspective, I think, is often how much of the election can we understand with a few variables, right? And that's sort of intellectually and academically super interesting. But then there's, okay, what's the actual outcome and what happened? And so in 2020, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was fewer than 70,000 votes across 4 states determined the outcome. Right. And so if we're thinking about those 70,000 people spread across 4 states and concentrated in a few counties in those states, all sorts of things can matter. Ads in the final days, that town hall performance, maybe, early voting. If people voting on election day, how's the weather? And so I think both can be true, that a lot of the outcome and a lot of voters' decisions are baked in already, and it makes sense. There's 2 parties. People know how they feel about the parties. They know a lot about both of these candidates, and not much is going to shift. And it can also be true that there's a relatively small number of people who are going to have the biggest influence on the outcome. And a lot of things could shift some of those people and make a difference if the election is close, coming down to election day.
I have just one follow-up on that, Peter. So both last times that Donald Trump ran, he way overperformed his polling. So, and the fact is that he is closer now than he ever was against Biden or Hillary at this point. So, is this, I guess my question for you is, and part of this is the 2020 polls, you could argue were messed up because of COVID. And I'm sort of curious, like pollsters obviously are scared of getting it wrong. So there's also a possibility they're overcorrecting and that they're undercounting Kamala Harris support in this case. And so I'm sort of curious, like what you make of the polling changes, whether or not they've been sufficient, and if you were to sort of say like it, if you were to bet which way they were undercounting, because every poll is probably undercounting a little bit. Like, which way do you think it would be?
Yeah, that's such an important question there, Alex, because you're absolutely right. At this time in 2020, the average across the polls had Biden at about +9 over Trump, and the election outcome was Biden about 4.5%. So yeah, they were about a little over 4%. Sort of in a democratic direction, and that's really been the case. And the polling organizations are aware of this, and we don't know exactly what each organization is doing to try to make adjustments. And so the top organizations affiliated with the major news networks, they provide pretty good information. They're very transparent about how they're sampling, how they're getting the respondents, how they're weighting the data, but we still don't know all of the details in the background. And I think you're exactly right there. And the other thing that's important to mention, historically, the polls are very accurate when it gets close to election day. So the early polling months in advance, that's variable, but it should be variable, right? It's asking people about what are you going to do in 3 months from now? Kind of like if we asked, where are you going to go to dinner in 3 months? I don't know. I mean, where are you going to go to dinner tonight? I'm not. I'm eating in tonight. I know what I'm having tonight. And so anytime we ask people about their behavior months in advance, whatever the topic, there's going to be a lot of variability. As we get close to election, the polls get closer. And historically, they're really quite accurate. But even so, there's been this, when Trump's in the races, there's been a sort of pro-democratic lean in the polls. So if I had to bet, I would say we're going to see that again, meaning Trump's underperforming in the polls. But I'm not putting a ton of money on that bet, meaning that, if you ask me which way I think it is, I think the lean is still in the same direction, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And I would be curious, from your and Laura's perspective on the campaign, and you see the polling data, and you're also talking to folks, and you're experiencing these campaign events. Like, can I put that back toward you and Laura? What would be your best guess about how the current polling showing really even, Harris-Trump, is it really even, or is it going in one direction or the other?
Go for it, Laura.
Well, I was going to answer a little bit and then ask Peter a question, but I would say that I think that polls in the last 2 cycles, and I'm counting 2022, seem to have understated the impact of abortion and Dobbs. So essentially that I think women, even this cycle, are highly motivated by that across age demographics, across race and ethnicity. And, in 2022, in the midterms, when there was this estimated massive red wave that was going to happen, I kept saying that I thought that there was somewhat of a silent abortion voter. And that turned out to be basically true. I mean, Democrats held on to the Senate and barely lost the House. I don't think that abortion has become any less salient. So I keep trying to gut check myself sometimes by saying, like, I think that people are going to be highly motivated by that issue this election cycle as well. And so, if anything, I think that people are underestimating women and abortion and how that's going to impact their vote this election cycle. And, I think some recent polling, and this is kind of going back to a question I have for you, Peter, seems to show that Trump is underwater with white women, which he wasn't previously compared to 2020, that he's not doing as well with women across the board, but also specifically with white women. Harris's campaign appears to think that she can max out the female vote, and that can help her with the shifting margins amongst men, Black, brown men as well, and young Gen Z men who appear to be shifting marginally towards Trump. So my question is, how much of that shift that we're seeing in some of the polls towards, amongst men and young men across race and ethnicity, how much of that is real, or is it soft? And
I just
again,
wanna-
does Harris, yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry, Laura. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to like two finger on this. Like, I think Laura is absolutely right that I think a lot of the media story the last several weeks has been about men and young men. And it's surprising to me, like how little agency they give women voters in these stories, right? Like there was a New York Times story about young white men heading toward Trump, which is not true if you look at the polling. But there's like this humongous, massive gender gap, especially among young women who say that they care about abortion. And like all of the media stories are about men. And it's a little bit of a frustrating like set of stories. And so, and if you look at the early turnout, there's a massive gender gap in early voting as well. And so I think we want to be paying attention to that gender gap in ways I think Laura's pointing out that we seem to, it's almost surprising to me in an election where we have a woman on the ballot, she doesn't want to talk about gender. I get that for various reasons, but like now we're genderizing this election, but to talk about young men, and it's just like a surprising thing to me. And so I think we need to pay much better attention to that.
Yeah, I have go ahead.
I was just to blur the lines a little bit more. I watch an awful lot of focus groups because I oversee an Axios swing voter focus group and a Syracuse battleground states focus group, and so what we just keep consistently seeing again and again and again is that especially women, some men care deeply about abortion, reproductive rights, bodily autonomy. They worry about their daughter's future. They say it'll impact what state they can live in. They get really upset about the laws, and sometimes they blame Trump and his Supreme Court nominees for it. But as they are trying to work out their decisions, these are persuadable people or undecideds, again and again and again, they go back to inflation, and the money in their pocket trumps abortion for so many of them. Now, I know these are qualitative groups. They're not a representative sample, and they are not voters who've already made up their mind. So we're not talking about hardcore women who are like, oh yes, this is why I'm voting. So I don't want to misrepresent that, but in the decision tree of this, there can be women who will be almost on the verge of tears, telling you how angry they are that abortion rights are being taken away, what an essential human rights issue it is to them. And then you're like, okay, is that the most important issue? And they're like, no, it's really not. And so that's my wild card. That's the part that I don't know the answer to, and we'll find out. And then afterwards, we can all figure out which analysis here was the most brilliant,
Well, and I think these can be pieced together to address what Laura is suggesting. And I think looking back to 2022, I think is really, really a smart move. And, extent these individuals we're talking about are in the polls, then the polls are accurate, right? They're representing who we intend to. So the question is, are some people, and the polling organizations are trying to reach everyone in a representative manner. So are there some folks who are less likely to take these surveys? And you could imagine a scenario where somebody who, and we're talking about the woman vote in particular, are super attentive and concerned with abortion, as Margaret's saying, but maybe historically have leaned Republican or been in favor of Trump. And so there's a conflict. And so you could imagine folks who are politically less certain or conflicted might be less likely to participate in a survey that they're invited to take about politics. So if that was the case, that would be a mechanism which would mean the surveys are underrepresenting this push toward Harris, as Laura was suggesting. And so, you know, when I was asked to where I put my money, I said I think that if anything, they're underrepresenting Trump. But I'm now making the case of a very plausible mechanism that could push it the other way. And that's why when I said I wouldn't put a lot of money on a bet, because we have a lot of uncertainty. And I think it's really important to remember the polling organizations are doing every cycle the best they can to learn from the past, adjust their methods, adjust their weighting, and to think about how to provide the most accurate, most representative data. And ultimately, if it's a close race, a poll could be less than 1% off and still be directionally wrong. So incredibly accurate polling can be directionally off, and there's just no way around that.
The last thing I would add to this is because I go basically back and forth on a daily or sometimes hourly basis on which side the polls could be off with, and I sometimes think exactly what Laura and Margaret articulated. Just to give you an idea of like the pro-Trump case that sometimes I make in my head after being on the road is the one thing that I do wonder, and some pollsters have thought this in the past, but the hostility toward the media at every Trump rally, at every Trump event, does make me wonder if they're undercounting the Trump vote, it could be as simple as they say, "Hey, do you want to talk to the New York Times polling outfit?" And the people that are more likely to say no are certainly Trump fans. And that would be my only case in my head, like as I'm making an argument for why they could still be undercounting the polls. It's just like they don't want to be polled. So that would be the counter case.
But some of the polling houses are now waiting on 2020 recall vote, right? And so that is part, and which we typically don't do because people are pretty bad at recalling their vote. There's bias in all sorts of ways. But like that's what New York Times is doing now is they're waiting. Their likely voter model includes 2020 vote as a screener. And so, you know, the real issue is low propensity voters, right? Like people who typically don't vote but are likely to be mobilized, and like if they're more on one side than the other, they're not going to show up in our likely voter models, and that's a real issue. I wasn't sure if we're allowed to like take this in a slightly different direction, because I wanted to ask I'm not the moderator, but I'm taking over. I wanted to ask actually a slightly different question about campaigns. So I think we do a lot of hand wringing about whether or not campaigns matter, but also how much they cost. And I just wanted to like start to think through with all of you whether or not we think campaigns are worth it. And so I had an advisor in graduate school who always would say like, Coca-Cola spends $4 billion a year on advertising. And if we spend $160 million on democracy, doesn't that seem like a bargain? And like, even if campaigns don't actually change anyone's votes, do we think that they are worth it for other reasons, right? And thinking about the stakes of our democracy and thinking about what issues we should care about and thinking about how we as a country want to move forward. And I don't, that's a little bit of, I'm not a journalist, so this is a little bit of a loaded question, but I think the question is more like, what is the worth of campaigns? If we can know 100 days ahead of time, what is the probability of one of the candidates winning or not? What are we doing for all of this time? And is it, what's the value of it? And that's for anyone.
I think there's a very compelling case to be made that spending $2 billion on the presidential, and I'm pretty sure we're going to go over $10 billion when you include all the national races, that money can be spent on much better things than
Like what? Like I really want to know, like what are we spending money on in the campaigns that we could be spending in other ways?
Oh, I mean, I think like just all the ads, I think could, you were saying like, I think we're right now at hundreds of millions of dollars of ads that are almost entirely negative. I don't know, but I was actually going to try to make a compelling case or try to make a case for why campaigns are good. Um, in that I do think they are stress tests for leaders, especially on the presidential level. I think if you talk to any of the people that, especially on like the Obama front, they would say that he was not probably prepared to be president when he declared to run for president, and he was actually a bad candidate to boot, and that not only that first year of just like having to meet people and really just like you hit the ground and you have to actually the way the presidential contest set up as reality television show as it is does really require you to like meet people, listen to people, and it does sort of push you and prod you and test your temperament in a way that I think is I think can be helpful. I think there's lots of downsides too in terms of this lengthy race has now created an environment in which you have to be good on TV. The debates are performative exercises about getting quips in. I always sort of look like if you put pictures of every president alongside each other, you notice that all of them all of a sudden become more handsome once television was invented. And I don't think that was a mistake. We had a lot of ugly presidents before television. Ugly presidents can be great presidents, and good-looking presidents can be terrible ones. So, anyway, that's again more of a word vomit exercise, but that's the pros and cons of our current campaign carnival.
That's good. And I would also add for our audience that there's obviously political science literature on how it helps educate citizens. People are more knowledgeable closer to elections than periods after an elections. Campaigns reach out and get people to volunteer and get them involved in democracy in ways that you might not have without them.
Although campaigns also increase political polarization. So during electoral periods, we see increases in sort of polarization, this idea of, the two sides become more kind of distant from each other, and also affective polarization. They also dislike each other more, and then it eases after the election. But, there is heightened animosity that occurs in part. I mean, the negative advertising probably doesn't help. But yeah, so that's the downside. But I agree with Chris. It also has some good upsides.
Great. So in the time we have left, we're now going to turn to the audience who have some questions. The first one I want to tee up is about Congress and the race for control of the House and Senate. Lauren, Alex, I know that you've been on the presidential campaigns, but do you want to start with where we are in the state of the race for control of Congress?
I'll just start really quick because I'm sorry to everyone, but I do have to go because I have two pieces on our show tonight, and we have early deadlines when you're on the show. So I guess, essentially, look, I think everyone is probably aware that the Senate map doesn't look very good for Democrats. It's highly likely that it flips to Republican control, even though some candidates like Sherrod Brown could very well end up surviving. But John Tester in Montana is having a very difficult race. The fact that Joe Manchin is not running again means that that's already a lost seat in West Virginia. So it would be very surprising if Democrats hold on to the Senate. But Democrats have a much better shot at flipping the House. And so there are races, key races in New York, in California, in Pennsylvania. One thing I will say about Democrats' chances in the House, a race that I'm looking at is Pennsylvania 10, which is where Scott Perry is the congressman. And local polling shows that he is significantly underwater there. He went from being only 1 point ahead in roughly June to his Democratic challenger to now he's about, I want to say, 7 to 8 points down. And that's pretty significant. And clearly Republicans were worried about that race, which has been a long held Republican seat because Speaker Mike Johnson went there just a weekend or so ago. And it kind of has some national implications because of the fact that Scott Perry is someone who supported, election lies about 2020 being rigged, was very much involved in all the action that went around January 6th and the attempts to present fake electors, as well as attempts to get a new Jeffrey Clark installed as the head of the Justice Department. Scott Perry was a part of all of that. And so he has a lot of moderate Republicans in his district, very middle of the road, independent type, older voters who are not happy with what he tried to do around January 6th. And there is a sense there, I did some reporting there earlier this year, that those voters are not happy with Scott Perry. And for the same reasons they're not happy with Scott Perry, they're not happy with Donald Trump. And so those are, again, that's a key part of Kamala Harris's strategy, which is that she is trying to convince these moderate Republicans based on the argument around law and order, Constitution, that she is someone who will uphold the rules of democracy, citing January 6th, citing Trump's own comments about what he would do and threats to terminate parts of the Constitution. So that's one race that I'm looking at closely because some Democrats are hopeful. It's not necessarily going to be the case, but are hopeful that anger towards some local Republicans could very well help her in those swing states.
All right, great. Well, Laura, thank you so very much for your participation and good luck with your deadlines today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Anyone else on the state of Congress, or Margaret, would you like to go to the next audience question?
I can, if you want, I can add.
Yeah, no, please.
Okay, so the Senate, Democrats will admit privately the Senate is essentially gone. And that's because once Joe Manchin retired, the Democrats had to run the table, and Democrats are increasingly skeptical they can win Montana. And if that's the case, then Republicans have 51-49. And then, as Laura sort of laid out, there are a bunch of other very close races. In some ways, the race for the House, you could look at the Democrats and Pelosi pushing out Biden as basically a way of giving them a chance to win the House. Because what the thing is that the House is very much dependent on swing states and swing districts and blue states. That is California, New York, Illinois, a few other states. And if you had a depressed Democratic base, which you did have with Joe Biden, even before the debate, but especially after the debate, there was a significant chance that not only Trump was going to win, but he was going to win all three. He was also going to win both chambers of Congress. And so now Democrats are in a much better position. They are way outraising Republicans in all these districts. There is an abortion. There are obviously these abortion rights amendment, ballot initiatives in some of these states, including New York. And so you do have, if I were to if you put a gun to my head and made me guess, I would guess that Democrats narrowly win the House and then lose the Senate.
Great, thanks.
So there's a couple questions here. They're different questions, but they get to the same idea in different ways. I just want to read both of them, and I'd be interested in Alex's take, but also any of our panelists' take. Okay, I'm going to try to condense this one, but here's the gist of it. The idea that the media is not doing its job in covering Trump correctly, and that's why Harris could lose this race, in my opinion, according to this questioner, is wrong. This questioner says Harris is losing the race for two reasons. She's a bad candidate and Biden was a bad president. She's gotten 100% positive coverage on legacy media shows. Trump's coverage is mostly negative. Late night hosts are bashing Trump and doing fundraisers for Harris, et cetera, et cetera. She should be dominating. So it's not really a question, it's a comment. Here's the companion question. During past similar change election cycles, a generic Republican would be 10 to 20 points ahead. This is a statement of how polarizing Trump is and how personally likable Harris is. Question, why have the Democrats seemingly moved so far to the left politically in response to this scenario? And especially if Trump wins, how will the Republicans ever move beyond Trump? So sorry, I throw just a bunch of stuff at everyone, but basically, panelists, Alex, et cetera, do you agree that this is really a referendum on Harris's skill as a candidate? And do you also agree that this proves how polarizing Trump is, that if he didn't have all this baggage, he would basically already have won the race?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, Trump is running against a quasi-incumbent, essentially, who has a 40% approval rating. And I think there was some deep denial. I think the fear of Trump led to a deep denial among Democrats about how voters were viewing Joe Biden. And some of this you could argue is not Joe Biden's fault, right? I mean, incumbents across the world are getting their butts kicked in part because of the inflation post-COVID, where a lot of money was dumped into the economy to keep it afloat. There is a global migration crisis that's hitting all parts of the West, not just America. But at the same time, Joe Biden also was the one that dismissed, sometimes with contempt, anyone that suggested inflation could be a problem for 9 months and kept calling it transitory. He's also the one that was defensive and dismissive of concerns about the border until, only really until about a year ago. And obviously the problems with Afghanistan are a clear line. If you just go to 538, how popular Joe Biden is, it's just reversal. August of 2021, Joe Biden has never recovered. And Democrats, I think, were just in a bit of a place of denial because about where he was with the American people. And I think some of that denial came from the better than expected midterm results. But I don't think that I think the midterm results in retrospect look a little bit more like a referendum on Dobbs and January 6th and sort of the Trump Republican Party than they were an affirmation of Biden's presidency. So I sort of agree. I disagree with some of the details of how they framed that, but I sort of agree that this is a race Republicans. It's a race that Republicans should be able to win, given how and this is not to say Joe Biden's a bad president. It's to say that this is how the American people feel about his presidency right now, which means Republicans should be able to win this race.
Thank you. Anyone else? Especially anyone who disagrees?
I mean, I think, given the fundamentals of the things that Peter has talked about, given when you see in the polling that people have lots of concerns about the economy, even though the economy on the whole is pretty good, people don't necessarily feel that. And so that kind of disconnect, I think, is also hard for people because they keep hearing that the economy is so good and the hiring is good and salaries are good, but they don't necessarily feel that. And so that feels like people aren't listening to them, and the president isn't listening to them. So I think all of that would suggest that this is a very winnable race for a generic Republican, but Trump is not a generic Republican, right? I mean, we talk about deep political polarization, and that's about the parties, but Trump is like, in some ways, sui generis. Like he is his own, character unto himself that creates very strong feelings, both among his most ardent supporters and among Democrats. And so I think the kind of, while the polls seem to kind of be off in the presidential level when he's on the ballot, part of that is because it's like character unto himself, and like probably other Republicans under these circumstances would be much further ahead given this this electorate. So I agree with that. And that's what you're seeing in the House and Senate races. We are like very closely divided. And the right candidate would be able to use those circumstances to kind of win outright. But we don't have that right now. We have kind of these, I wouldn't say that I think Harris is a bad candidate. I also don't think that her media coverage is super positive. But I think, you know, she has the baggage of the Biden administration, which for all the reasons Alex said, has been pretty unpopular.
So can I ask a question off that point for the panel? There was an opportunity with the candidate switch for her to try to grab the mantle of the change candidate, right? Like, you know, people didn't really know who she was because she was vice president. She could lay out an agenda that maybe built off some of the popular things for the Biden campaign, such as like the infrastructure bill, which, you know, was shovels and dirt projects. Would that have been impossible for her to grab the mantle of the change agent, given that she's running against a former president and the kind of historic switch that took place over the summer? Was she locked in to having to be an extension of the Biden administration?
I'll just say very quickly, I think conceptually, it's really tough when you're the vice president. We saw this when Al Gore ran in 2000. He followed the Clinton administration. He tried to actually run as a challenger, critiquing the policies and positions of his former administration. And that seemed really odd. And we saw how that landed. So I just think that vice presidents have a really tough time rhetorically in terms of how they construct their message. They can't really convincingly make an argument for change because that basically rejects the positions and the policies of the administration they've been a part of. So it's a very tough challenge, I think, for especially vice presidents who step into that first role.
I mean, agree with Jennifer, and I would just add one other, she also is not the most nimble on her feet, and she clearly has botched a bunch of these answers about how she would differentiate herself from Joe Biden. But I also think that one other part of this that I think is a little underappreciated is that if she were to just say, Biden messed up on X, or I would do X differently, there was a risk that she was going to be seen as disloyal in a way that also I think she had to navigate sexism in this way. Like for a man to do that, it could be seen as a sign of strength. For a woman to do it, there's a real risk that it would be seen as sort of disloyal. And I think they were cognizant of that because there was a part of the electorate that thought that Joe Biden had been treated unfairly, and she did not want to alienate those people.
I do think, though, that one difference between Harris stepping in versus Gore, when Gore was the candidate, his approval ratings were lower than Clinton's. So he's had a disadvantage from that perspective, where Harris was coming in with higher approval ratings based on her performance than Biden. And I think I agree with this point, Alex's point, that she had to sort of show it's the same party, same administration, some loyalty. But I think there could be or could have been more recognition of some concerns in the electorate, and here's how we're going to do more. And I think that there's I think that's what's been missing. And again, I'm not sure how much the campaigns matter, but to the extent we're thinking about that small group of potential voters in these few states, really drilling down and say, we hear these concerns, here's what we've been doing. and here's what I will do even more. I think her approval ratings gave her the space to do that, but we haven't seen it yet.
Totally agree. I completely agree. Not that you asked me. I know we're almost out of time. Chris, can I tuck in one question and we can answer it really shortly?
Yeah,
and then
quick question,
we gotta go?
kind of a lightning round question. Yeah.
One of our Q&As asks, depending on how the election turns out, do you think that there will be a serious renewed challenge to the electoral system, especially if the House changes majorities? And I guess the question is twofold. Could there be a political push for a change to the Electoral College? And will there be mounting public demand, especially among people who don't live in 7 battleground states, to blow up the Electoral College? So like 30 seconds of answers and then we'll move on.
No and no. I mean, right, the regular public doesn't care about electoral rules. Activists care about electoral rules, and the only people who care about electoral rules are the people who lose. And so when you start to think about who's going to demand change, it has to be both parties, and they have to see equal benefit to changing the rules.
Yeah, I agree with Shana. I mean, I personally think it's time for us as a democracy to step back a little bit and think about some of these institutional and structural systems. You know, I'm looking at the amount of money that's being spent in campaigns, the lack of disclosures. You know, it's concerning. There's not much transparency. There are lots of structural issues, and I think it makes our democracy vulnerable. But that's not sexy, so I don't expect much out of this election on that front.
I will eat a hat if they ever get rid of the Electoral College. And I completely agree with both of your points on it. The Electoral College is a Frankenstein monster of a compromise, and if the people at the center of the Constitutional Convention could not figure out another way, there is no way we're going to do it with 50 states. So it is terrible, awful, inelegant system, but I don't see it going anywhere.
So actually, I'm going to counter all of this, right? Here's how it happens. Ready? Trump wins the popular vote and loses in the Electoral College. There we go. That will bring about reform.
I don't know. You heard it here first.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists today for a really excellent discussion on the 2024 election and putting it into the context of American democracy. I also want to thank all the wonderful support behind the scenes from Jackie Naszewski and Kelly Coleman, Matt Coulter and the IT team, all the support from the Dean's office, George and Kathy Hicker for all of their support for the Maxwell School. And I want to let the audience know, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement today. And we have one more election centennial event coming up. If you are in Syracuse, come here to the Maxwell Auditorium. November 8th on a Friday at 4 o'clock. We will have some of the brightest people in the building talking about and helping you understand what happened with the election, and also a really nice hors d'oeuvre table. So enjoy the next 2 weeks, and we will see you on the other side. Thank you.